Lady Arabella Fairfax stood at the entrance to the Ashford House ballroom and felt the weight of 300 pairs of eyes turn toward her like flowers following the sun, except there was no warmth in these gazes, only curiosity sharpened by the black silk of her morning gown that stood stark against the sea of pastel muslins and jewel-toned satins swirling across the marble floor. She had not wanted to come tonight, had pleaded with her aunt to let her remain in the quiet sanctuary of her rooms where she could touch the secret growing beneath her heart without fear of observation. But Lady Georgiana Tilney had been insistent that hiding away would only fuel speculation, and so here she stood, her gloved hand resting briefly against her still flat abdomen in an unconscious protective gesture before she forced herself to lower it and step forward into the glittering palace of excess that was the height of the London season. The ballroom blazed with light from crystal chandeliers that cast rainbow prisms across floors so polished they reflected the dancers like a still pond, and gold leaf gleamed on every cornice and moulding, proclaiming the wealth of the Ashford family with the subtlety of a trumpet blast. The June heat made the space stifling despite the French doors standing open to the garden, and the scent of hothouse roses mingled with expensive perfumes and the sweet fizz of champagne and the waxy smell of hundreds of candles burning in their sconces. Arabella moved through the crowd with quiet dignity, acknowledging greetings with small nods, feeling the whispers follow her like the train of her gown, knowing they spoke of her mourning, and wondered at her presence here so soon after the Duke of Thornbury's death. If only they knew. If only they could imagine that she was not merely mourning a distant acquaintance, but grieving her husband, the man she had married in secret 3 months ago when his health was failing and his family would have opposed the match, the man who had given her 3 months of unexpected joy before death claimed him 2 weeks past. She touched her abdomen again, unable to help herself, thinking of the child she had only just discovered she carried, the legitimate heir to the Thornbury dukedom, the son or daughter who would never know their father, but who would bear his name and title if Arabella could find the courage to reveal the truth of their marriage. Edmund had made her promise to wait until after the funeral, had wanted to spare his family the shock of discovering his marriage at the same moment they learned of his death, had thought he was protecting her by giving her time to prepare, but she had honored his wishes, and now she stood here in black silk while society whispered and wondered and had no idea that she was the Duchess of Thornbury. Across the ballroom, near the refreshment table where champagne flowed like water and servants moved with practiced efficiency, Sebastian Wentworth stood with a glass, clenched in his hand, and watched the woman in black move through the crowd with a grace that made his jaw tighten and his fingers grip the delicate crystal until he feared it might shatter. He had his father's dark hair and grey eyes, the strong Wentworth features that proclaimed his bloodline as clearly as any coat of arms, but he had none of the legitimacy that should have come with that face, none of the title or recognition or place in society that his younger half-brother Henry would inherit simply because his mother had worn a wedding ring. Sebastian had returned to London only 3 days ago after spending the last year managing the northern estates that would never be his, had come for his father's funeral and stayed because he could not bear to return to Northumberland, where every field and tenant and profitable decision he made only reminded him that he was good enough to manage a dukedom, but not to inherit one. He had loved his father in the complicated way one loves a man who gave you life but could never give you his name, who was proud of your accomplishments but could not acknowledge you as his son in any way that mattered, who left you a generous bequest in his will, but nothing that could erase the stain of bastardy from your birth. And now, watching this woman glide across the ballroom in her expensive mourning clothes, Sebastian felt rage build in his chest like steam in a kettle because he knew who she was, had made inquiries after seeing her name in his father's private papers, had learned that she had visited the London townhouse multiple times in the months before Edmund died, and he knew exactly what that meant. She was a fortune hunter, a schemer who had preyed upon a lonely, dying man's need for companionship, who had probably coaxed gifts and promises from him in exchange for her pretty face and false sympathy, who had no doubt laughed behind her fan at how easy it was to manipulate an old man facing his mortality. The champagne burned in Sebastian's throat as he drank, the bubbles sharp and bitter, and he thought about how his father had always been susceptible to a lovely face, how his first wife had been a beauty who led him a merry dance, how even in his final months Edmund Wentworth had apparently been fool enough to let some conniving girl twist him around her finger. Sebastian set down his glass with enough force that the servant nearby startled, and before he could think better of it, before the rational part of his mind could counsel patience or investigation or even basic civility, he was striding across the ballroom floor with his anger as his compass and his bitterness as his guide. The crowd parted before him, sensing drama the way sharks sense blood in water, and by the time he reached Arabella Fairfax, the entire assembly had fallen into that particular hush that precedes scandal. She turned at his approach, her face calm and composed, and for a moment he almost faltered, because up close she was even lovelier than he had realized, with clear grey eyes and a mouth made for smiling, though it was solemn now, and there was something in her bearing that spoke of genuine grief rather than performance. But then he remembered his father's lonely final months, remembered being kept at a distance while strangers had access, remembered that he had not even known Edmund was dying until it was almost too late, and his anger solidified into something cold and sharp. "Tell me, Miss Fairfax," Sebastian said, and his voice rang across the ballroom with perfect clarity, carrying to every corner of the vast space. "What was the price of your companionship? What trinkets did you coax from a dying old man who should have been left in peace?" He watched her face drain of colour, watched her mouth open as if to speak, watched her eyes go wide with shock, and something that looked almost like recognition, though he knew she had never met him. "You," she whispered, the word barely audible. "You don't understand. I never." But Sebastian was beyond listening, beyond caring about the truth when he had already constructed his own version of events and polished it smooth with months of resentment. "I understand perfectly," he cut across her words, his voice dripping with contempt that he had spent 28 years accumulating. "Women like you circle men like my father like vultures. Did you think no one would notice your visits, that there would be no reckoning?" The ballroom had gone utterly silent now, the orchestra trailing off mid-phrase, fans frozen in mid-flutter, 300 members of the ton holding their collective breath as they watched reputation destroyed before their eyes. Someone in the crowd, an older matron with a face like a dried apple and a tongue like a serpent, spoke into the silence with false sympathy dripping from every word. Poor dear, caught out at last, and the murmur that followed was like wasps beginning to swarm. Lady Georgiana Tilney pushed through the crowd, her face flushed with anger and alarm, calling Sebastian's name with authority. "Sebastian Wentworth, you will cease this immediately. You know nothing of what you speak." But Sebastian stepped forward to block her path, his body a wall between Arabella and her only defender. "I know enough," he said, his voice gone quiet now, but no less vicious for the softness. "I know she manipulated a man who deserved better in his final days. I know she preyed upon his loneliness and his weakness. And I know that if there is any justice in this world, society will see her for exactly what she is." Arabella stood frozen, one hand pressed to her throat where her pulse hammered like a trapped bird, the other unconsciously moving to her abdomen where Edmund's child rested safe and unknowing, and she could not speak, could not defend herself. could not find words to explain that she had been Edmund's wife, not his mistress, that she had loved him truly despite their age difference, that she carried the legitimate heir to Thornbury, and this man, this stranger who wore Edmund's face, was destroying any chance she might have had to prove it. The bright, glittering ballroom had transformed into a coliseum. The beautiful people in their expensive clothes had become an audience hungry for blood sport, and she was the sacrifice offered up to their entertainment, and all around her the whispers grew like thorns, wrapping around her reputation and her future and her child's inheritance. And she knew with terrible certainty that no matter what truth she spoke now, no matter what proof she might someday present, this moment would follow her forever. This accusation would stain everything she touched. And the man responsible stood before her with righteous anger blazing in eyes the exact shade of Edmund's, and she hated him with a depth of feeling that terrified her, even as her knees threatened to buckle and darkness crept at the edges of her vision. And somewhere very far away she heard her aunt calling her name. Arabella fled the Ashford ballroom with what remained of her dignity wrapped around her like armour that had already been pierced through, her aunt's strong arm around her waist, the only thing keeping her upright as they pushed through the avid crowd that parted with exaggerated sympathy, while eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of witnessing a spectacular fall from grace. And she made it to the carriage before the first sob tore from her throat, a sound so raw and broken that Lady Georgiana Tilney pulled her niece against her shoulder and held her while she shattered into pieces. The carriage lurched into motion, carrying them away from the golden windows and music and malicious whispers, and Arabella wept with the abandon of someone who has lost everything, her careful composure crumbling like sand castles before the tide. And between gasping breaths she pressed both hands to her abdomen, where Edmund's child rested safe and unknowing. And she thought that this tiny life would pay the price for her destroyed reputation, would be called bastard when it was legitimate, would be denied its birthright because she could not prove the truth without being called a liar and a schemer. Lady Georgiana made the decision without consulting her niece, directing the driver to her own Mayfair townhouse rather than the Fairfax estate, where Arabella's stepmother, Lady Henrietta, resided. That cold woman who had never shown Arabella anything but disdain, and would surely turn her away now that scandal had painted her in such ugly colours. And when they arrived, Georgiana helped her niece from the carriage, and up the steps and into a borrowed bedchamber decorated in soft blues and creams, that should have been peaceful but felt instead like a tomb when Arabella drew the curtains against the afternoon sun and collapsed onto the bed, still wearing her black silk gown that now felt like a shroud. 3 days passed in a fog of grief and shock, 3 days during which Arabella lay in the darkened room with one hand always resting on her still flat abdomen, a talisman against the cruelty of the world outside, and she could not eat the food her aunt brought, could not summon the strength to change from her nightdress, or brush her hair, or do anything but lie there and relive the moment when Sebastian Wentworth had destroyed her in front of everyone who mattered in London society. Lady Georgiana sat vigil beside the bed, speaking gentle encouragement that Arabella could not truly hear through the roaring in her ears, bringing tea that grew cold untouched and toast that hardened on the plate, and she watched her niece with growing alarm, because this was more than simple mortification. This was the kind of despair that could break a person completely if left unchecked. On the morning of the 4th day, Arabella finally spoke, her voice hollow as an empty well. "My child will be called a bastard because of what he did. The legitimate heir to a dukedom labelled a bastard because I cannot prove the truth." And the words hung in the air like a confession and a curse combined. Lady Georgiana leaned forward, her capable hands taking Arabella's cold fingers in a firm grip, and said, "Tell me everything, child. Tell me the whole truth and leave nothing out." And so Arabella did, the story spilling from her lips in a torrent that had been dammed up for too long. She told of meeting Edmund Wentworth at a small gathering 6 months before his death, of how she had expected an old man diminished by illness, but found instead someone with sharp wit and kind eyes who looked at her as if she were a person rather than a pretty ornament, of how their friendship had deepened through walks in the park and afternoons taking tea and conversations that ranged from poetry to politics to the peculiar loneliness of being misunderstood by the world. She told of Edmund's proposal, offered with shaking hands and humble hope, of how he had said he knew it was selfish to ask a young woman to tie herself to a dying man, but that he wanted to give her what protection he could, wanted to see her established and secure before he left this world, and more than that, wanted to know the joy of calling her his wife, even if only for a little while. She told of their secret marriage, in a small church with only the vicar and 2 witnesses present, of Edmund's explanation that he wanted to wait until after his death to announce it so his family would not feel shocked or betrayed during his final months, of how he had made her promise to honor his wishes, even though she had argued that secrecy would make everything harder. She told of his death 2 weeks ago, of holding his hand as he slipped away with a smile on his face, of the funeral where she had stood at the back because she had no recognized right to mourn him publicly. And finally, voice-breaking, she told of discovering her pregnancy only days ago, of the joy and terror that had filled her in equal measure because Edmund's child meant hope and continuation, but also vulnerability and risk. "Edmund made me promise to wait until after the funeral," Arabella said, tears streaming down her pale face. He wanted to spare his family, wanted the transition to be gentle. I honored his wishes, and now I am destroyed for it, destroyed by his own son who thinks I am a fortune hunter when I am actually his father's wife. Lady Georgiana absorbed all of this with the steady calm of a woman who had navigated society's treacherous waters for 3 decades, and then she rose and went to her writing desk and penned a swift note. And within the hour, Edmund's solicitor, Mr. Thomas Dashwood, was being shown into her private study, a wood-panelled room filled with books, where the smell of leather bindings and old paper provided an odd sort of comfort. Mr. Dashwood was elderly, with a kind face creased by years of witnessing both the best and worst of human nature, and he carried a leather case that he set on the desk, with hands that shook slightly, whether from age or emotion, Arabella could not tell. He had been expecting this summons, he said quietly, had known that eventually Lady Arabella would need the materials that the Duke had entrusted to his care, and with reverent movements he withdrew documents from the case and spread them on the polished wood surface. There was the marriage certificate, official and legal, and stamped with all the proper seals. There were letters in Edmund's own bold hand. There was a witnessed statement signed by the vicar who had performed the ceremony, and there was a letter addressed to Arabella in Edmund's writing that Mr. Dashwood handled as if it were made of spun glass. Let it be known that I, Edmund Wentworth, Duke of Thornbury, being of sound mind and clear purpose, did legally wed Lady Arabella Fairfax on the 15th of March, 1847. Mr. Dashwood read aloud, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. This union was not the folly of illness, but the joy of a heart that thought itself beyond such happiness. She brought light to my final months, and I go to my rest content, knowing I have secured her future. Let no man question the legitimacy of this marriage, or cast aspersions upon the character of my beloved wife who honored me by accepting my hand. Arabella listened to Edmund's words and wept anew because he had thought he was protecting her, had believed that his careful preparations would shield her from doubt and difficulty, had no idea that his illegitimate son would strike before she could even present her case. "He thought he was protecting me," she said brokenly. "He had no idea His own son would destroy me before I had a chance to prove the truth. Mr. Dashwood's expression grew grave, and he folded his hands on the desk. "I must tell you something that will distress you further, Your Grace," and he used her title deliberately, as if to remind her of what she had every legal right to claim. Sebastian Wentworth filed a legal challenge 3 days ago, the very day after the incident at the ball, claiming that even if a marriage certificate exists, it must have been obtained through undue influence over a sick elderly man. He is demanding a full investigation before any inheritance claims are recognized, and he has considerable support among certain members of the peerage, who find it convenient to believe his version of events. The words hit Arabella like physical blows, and she rose from her chair and began to pace the study like a caged animal, fury rising through the fog of grief and giving her strength she had not known she possessed. "He destroys me in public, then ensures I cannot defend myself in private," she said, her voice shaking with rage. "What manner of man could be so cruel, so determined to ruin someone he does not even know?" Mr. Dashwood watched her with sad understanding. Sebastian Wentworth has lived his entire life as the capable son denied his birthright by the accident of his birth. He managed the northern estates brilliantly, served his father loyally, and received nothing but gratitude where he deserved a title. I do not excuse his actions, but I understand his bitterness. He sees you as someone who manipulated his father for gain, and in his twisted logic, he believes he is protecting Edmund's memory by exposing you. Lady Georgiana spoke then, her voice cutting through Arabella's distress with practical sharpness. "Understanding him does not help us. We need a plan. When will you begin to show child?" Arabella stopped pacing and touched her abdomen. The midwife said, "Perhaps 3 more months before it becomes obvious. 4 if I am fortunate and wear the right clothing. But what does that matter when no court will believe me? When Sebastian has already poisoned everyone against me?" Mr. Dashwood leaned forward, his expression deeply troubled. "That is precisely the problem. Your Grace, if you come forward now in the immediate wake of the scandal, no magistrate or peer will believe you are telling the truth. They will assume you have fabricated evidence to salvage your reputation, or worse, that you are attempting to pass off another man's child as the Duke's legitimate heir. You need time for the scandal to fade, time to gather witnesses who can testify to the Duke's state of mind when he married you, time to build an irrefutable case." "But time is what I do not have," Arabella said, her hand still pressed to her belly. "I have 3 months, perhaps 4, before my condition becomes visible, and once society sees I am with child, while claiming to be a widow, married in secret, they will call me a liar and a whore, and my baby will be labelled a bastard, no matter what proof I present." The room fell silent, except for the sound of rain beginning to streak the windows, London's summer weather as changeable as fortune, and the 3 of them sat in that wood-panelled sanctuary, surrounded by books and documents and impossible choices, and the atmosphere was heavy with loss and fear and the oppressive weight of limited options. Outside the study, carriages rattled past, carrying people to their ordinary lives. Flower sellers called their wares. The city moved on in its relentless rhythm. But inside this room, Arabella's world had contracted to a single terrible question, with no good answer. How could she prove her marriage and protect her child, when the man who should have been her ally had instead become her destroyer? When time was both her enemy and her only hope? When every path forward led through a gauntlet of disbelief and condemnation? Lady Georgiana broke the silence at last. "We must be clever about this. Rage will not serve you, my dear. Strategy will. We have the evidence, we have the truth, and we have some small amount of time. We must use all 3 wisely, and we must be prepared for Sebastian Wentworth to fight us at every turn, because he believes he is in the right, and there is nothing more dangerous than a man who thinks his cruelty is justified." Arabella sank back into her chair, exhausted by emotion and the weight of the child she carried, and the magnitude of the battle ahead, and she looked at the documents spread across the desk, Edmund's careful handwriting proclaiming his love and his legal commitment, proof that should have been unassailable, but which now felt as fragile as paper in a fire. And she thought about her baby who would inherit a dukedom or be labelled a bastard depending on choices she had not yet figured out how to make. And somewhere in London, Sebastian Wentworth sat in his own study, believing he had struck a blow for justice when he had instead destroyed an innocent woman and endangered his own unborn sibling. And the cruelty of it all, the terrible irony that the legitimate heir's greatest enemy was the bastard son, who should have understood better than anyone the pain of being denied one's birthright, was almost more than she could bear. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. Every subscriber brings us closer to 1,000, which helps us keep these stories alive and coming your way. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. 6 weeks after the ball that had destroyed her reputation, Arabella walked the private gardens of Lady Georgiana's Somerset estate, with her shawl wrapped tight around shoulders that had grown thinner from worry and grief, though her waist had begun to thicken with the life growing inside her, a constant reminder of both hope and urgency that made every day feel like sand slipping through an hourglass she could not turn. The countryside offered peace that London could never provide, distance from the whispers and pointed stares, and cut direct that had followed her through Mayfair like a poisonous cloud. And here among the roses and lavender she could breathe without feeling society's judgment pressing. Against her ribs, could rest her hand on her abdomen without fear of observation. Could feel the quickening movements of Edmund's child and allow herself brief moments of joy untainted by terror. She had begun to show, despite her naturally slender frame, the changes subtle enough that loose mourning dresses and carefully draped shawls concealed them from casual observation. But she knew time was running short, knew that in another month or two no amount of clever tailoring would hide her condition, and then the scandal that Sebastian Wentworth had ignited would become an inferno that would consume everything she had left. The morning air was cool and damp with mist that clung to the ground like smoke, and Arabella followed the path that wound through the formal gardens and into the woods beyond where ancient oaks stood sentinel, and the bridle path cut through the estate toward the neighbouring properties. And she was thinking about nothing in particular, simply enjoying the silence and the green peace of the countryside, when she heard a horse's distressed whinny, followed by a heavy thud that made her blood run cold. She gathered her skirts and ran toward the sound, her heart pounding with alarm, and when she rounded the bend in the path, she found a large bay gelding standing riderless, with wild eyes and heaving sides. And on the ground a man lay motionless, his dark hair matted with blood from a gash on his temple, where he had struck a fallen log, or perhaps a rock, when he fell. Arabella knelt beside him with practiced efficiency. Her father had been a country gentleman who believed his daughters should know how to handle emergencies, and she checked for breath and pulse, and found both, though the man remained unconscious, and the blood flow from his head wound was alarming in its profusion. She reached for her handkerchief to press against the injury, her hands steady despite her racing heart, and it was only when she tilted his face toward her to better assess the damage that recognition hit her like a physical blow. Sebastian Wentworth, the man who had destroyed her reputation and challenged her marriage and ensured she could not claim her rightful place as Edmund's widow, lay helpless before her, vulnerable and bleeding and completely at her mercy. And for one terrible moment, Arabella felt the temptation to simply walk away, to leave him here where he had fallen, to let fate or fortune or divine justice decide whether he lived or died. She actually stepped back, her hand going to her throat as horror and vindictive satisfaction warred in her chest, because surely this was some kind of cosmic retribution. Surely the universe was offering her a chance to balance the scales by doing nothing, by simply turning around and walking back to the house and pretending she had never seen him at all. But even as the thought formed, her conscience rebelled against it, because whatever else she might be, whatever society might think of her, she was not someone who could leave another human being to die in the dirt, no matter how much they had wronged her. And with a sound that was half sob and half curse, she dropped back to her knees beside Sebastian and pressed her handkerchief against his wound with shaking hands. He groaned at the pressure, his eyelids fluttering but not opening, and Arabella spoke to him in the firm voice she had heard doctors use with injured men. "Mr. Wentworth, can you hear me? You must wake up. You have been thrown from your horse and you are injured." His eyes opened slowly, unfocused and confused, grey as storm clouds and exactly like Edmund's, and he stared at her without recognition, which was hardly surprising given that he had only seen her once in the ballroom's golden light, and she now wore a simple country dress with her hair caught back in a practical bun, and no jewels or fine fabrics to mark her as anything other than a servant or companion. "Can you stand?" she asked. "We need to get you inside. There is a hunting lodge not far from here, closer than the main house. Can you walk if I help you?" Sebastian blinked at her, struggling to focus, and mumbled something about his horse, about needing to continue his journey. But Arabella cut across his protests with sharp authority. "Your horse is fine, but you are not. You have a head wound, and you need shelter and medical attention. Now put your arm around my shoulders and try to stand." Getting him upright was a struggle that left them both breathing hard, Sebastian's weight heavy against her side, and Arabella felt the strain in her back and legs, felt the small life in her belly protest the exertion, and she prayed he was too dazed to notice the slight roundness of her figure beneath her loose dress as they stumbled together along the path toward the small stone lodge that stood at the edge of the woods. He mumbled as they walked, fragments of sentences that made little sense, something about being late, about estates that needed managing, about his father who never understood, and Arabella gritted her teeth and concentrated on keeping them both upright until they reached the lodge door and she could maneuver him inside to the large bed that dominated the single room. The lodge was rustic but comfortable, used by Lady Georgiana's late husband for hunting parties, with a stone fireplace and simple furniture and supplies kept stocked for emergencies exactly like this one, and Arabella helped Sebastian onto the bed and then set about building a fire because the morning was cold and he would need warmth. And once flames were crackling, she heated water and found clean cloths and set about properly cleaning and bandaging his head wound while he drifted in and out of consciousness. That first night he was delirious with pain and confusion, mumbling words that cut Arabella to the quick even as she tended him with gentle hands. "Father never looked at me the way he looked at Henry," Sebastian said, his eyes closed and his face pale. Against the pillow, legitimate son, always the legitimate son. I was good enough to manage his lands, but not to bear his name, not good enough to be acknowledged as his heir. Arabella wrung out the cloth she was using to cool his fever, and whispered to herself, "And so you wounded another person, denied their rightful place. We are not so different, you and I." But he did not hear her, lost in his own pain and memories. Rain began to fall as darkness came, first a patter and then a deluge that lashed the windows and turned the world outside into a grey blur. And Arabella realized with sinking heart that she was trapped here, the storm too violent to risk the walk back to the main house, the roads that Sebastian had been travelling already turning to mud that would be impassable by morning. She settled into the chair by the fire and watched the man who had destroyed her reputation sleep fitfully on the bed. And she wondered what cruel twist of fate had brought them together like this. Hunter and prey reversed, victim tending victimizer, the whole natural order turned on its head. The second day, Sebastian was more lucid, though still weak, and he accepted the broth she brought him and allowed her to change his bandages without protest. And when he asked who she was, Arabella told him simply that she was Miss Fairfax, companion to Lady Georgiana, which was true enough, even if it omitted certain crucial details, like the fact that she was actually the Duchess of Thornbury, and he had publicly accused her of being a scheming fortune hunter. The storm continued outside, rain drumming on the roof and wind howling through the trees, and the enforced intimacy of the small space made conversation inevitable. Sebastian spoke more freely than he would have if he knew who she was, his guard down in his weakened state, and Arabella listened despite herself as he revealed the architecture of his pain. "My father had visitors in his last months," he said, staring at the ceiling. "A young woman. Everyone assumed. I assumed the worst. I should have asked him. I should have trusted him. But I was angry. I am always angry." Arabella kept her voice carefully neutral as she asked, "Perhaps your anger blinds you to truth." Sebastian turned his head to look at her, his grey eyes sharp despite his injury. Perhaps truth is whatever leaves the least pain behind, which is why people choose the version that confirms what they already believe. I believed my father was being manipulated because it was easier than believing he might have found happiness that did not include me. The words hung in the air between them, honest and raw, and Arabella felt her certainty waver, because this was not the voice of a cruel man, but a wounded one. Not a villain, but a victim of circumstances beyond his control, and she found herself sympathizing despite the rage she had nursed for 6 weeks. The third day dawned clear, the storm having blown itself out during the night, and pale sunlight streamed through, the windows illuminating dust motes that danced in the golden beams, and Sebastian woke with clearer eyes and a steadier focus, and Arabella knew the moment of reckoning had arrived before he even turned his head to look at her properly. She watched his eyes travel over her face, watched them narrow as familiarity tickled at the edges of his memory, watched them widen as full recognition crashed over him like a wave. "You," he said, sitting up so quickly he swayed with dizziness. "You are her, the woman from the ball, the woman I—" And he trailed off, horror dawning in his expression as the full implications settled into place. Arabella stood and moved toward the door, her chin lifted in defiance even as her hands trembled. "Yes, after what you did to me, I suggest you remember this moment, Mr. Wentworth, the next time you decide to destroy someone based on assumptions." Sebastian pushed himself to his feet, swaying dangerously, one hand pressed to his bandaged head. "Wait, please, let me— I need to understand. Were you my father's mistress?" The question was asked with less venom than she expected, confusion and dawning shame replacing the righteous anger she remembered from the ballroom, but it still cut deep, and Arabella's voice broke with suppressed rage and grief as she answered, "I was your father's wife." The words fell into the sunlit room like stones into still water, creating ripples that spread and spread, and Sebastian stared at her with his mouth open and his face draining of what little color the last 3 days had restored, and she could see him working through the implications, could watch understanding and horror and terrible regret chase each other across his features. The silence stretched between them, heavy with revelation, and through the windows morning light poured in as if illuminating truth at last, and somewhere outside a bird began to sing oblivious to the human drama unfolding in the hunting lodge, and Arabella stood with her back to the door, and her hand unconsciously resting on the slight swell of her abdomen where Sebastian's legitimate sibling grew, the heir he had tried to deny before it was even born, and she waited to see what he would do with this knowledge that changed everything. Sebastian returned to London from Somerset in a state of turmoil that made the journey pass in a blur of rain-streaked countryside and churning thoughts. because the revelation that Arabella Fairfax was not his father's mistress, but his father's wife, had shattered every assumption he had built his righteous anger upon and left him staring into an abyss of his own making, where the monster was not some scheming fortune hunter, but himself. He went directly to his study and pulled out every document related to his father's estate, spreading them across the mahogany desk with hands that shook slightly, searching for evidence he had been too angry to look for before, too certain of his own narrative to question whether it might be wrong. The marriage certificate existed in the solicitor's files, legal and properly witnessed, dated 3 months before Edmund's death, when his father had still been lucid and capable despite his failing body, and Sebastian stared at the signatures and seals and felt sick, because this was not some deathbed coercion. This was a deliberate choice made by a man who knew exactly what he was doing. He found letters, too, correspondence between Edmund and Mr. Dashwood discussing the marriage settlement, instructions for how Arabella should be provided for after his death, words that spoke of affection and careful planning rather than manipulation or undue influence. Sebastian paced his study as afternoon faded to evening, picking up documents and setting them down, running his hands through his dark hair until it stood on end, and finally he stopped before the window, where his reflection stared back at him with his father's grey eyes and strong features, the Wentworth face that had never been enough to make him legitimate, and he whispered, "What have I done into the gathering darkness?" He had destroyed an innocent woman based on jealousy and bitterness, had publicly branded her a fortune hunter when she was actually the Duchess of Thornbury, had filed legal challenges to prevent her from claiming what was rightfully hers, and worst of all, he had done it believing himself to be in the right, had wrapped his cruelty in the cloak of protecting his father's memory, when really he had been protecting nothing but his own wounded pride. The weight of it crushed him, made it hard to breathe, and for the first time since childhood, Sebastian felt tears prick his eyes, because he had become exactly what he most despised. Someone who used power to hurt the powerless. Someone who let pain turn him cruel. 3 days into his investigation, a letter arrived from a society matron he barely knew. The kind of malicious gossip wrapped in false concern that made London's drawing rooms so poisonous, and she wrote to inform him that Lady Henrietta Fairfax had been spreading the most interesting rumours about her stepdaughter, claiming that Arabella must be with child from some illicit affair, and that was why she had fled to the country, that the girl was probably trying to find some way to pass off a bastard as legitimate, and decent people should be warned. Sebastian read the letter twice, his stomach turning to ice, because if Arabella was pregnant, then the child would be his father's legitimate heir, would be his own half-sibling, would be the true Duke or Duchess of Thornbury, and not Henry, who had been preparing to assume the title. And Sebastian realized with dawning horror that his actions might condemn an innocent child to exactly the fate he himself had suffered. Bastard, in fact, if not in name, denied their birthright, growing up knowing they were not quite good enough. The thought was unbearable, intolerable, and Sebastian made his decision in that moment, standing in his study with the vicious letter still in his hand. He would fix this. He would make it right. He would ensure that no child paid the price for his mistakes, even if it meant publicly admitting his error and championing the claim of a sibling who would inherit everything he had always wanted. He wrote to Lady Georgiana requesting a formal meeting, made the journey back to Somerset within the week, and when he arrived at the estate and sent in his card, he half expected to be turned away, would not have blamed Arabella if she refused to see him. But after a long wait, a footman returned and showed him to the drawing-room, where autumn sunlight poured through tall windows overlooking gardens where leaves had turned to gold and amber. Lady Georgiana was there, regal and watchful in a chair upholstered in cream silk, and after a moment Arabella entered, wearing a loose morning gown in soft blue that could not hide the swell of her pregnancy, now that Sebastian knew to look for it, and his eyes dropped to her abdomen and his face drained of color because the evidence of his father's child was unmistakable and the reality of what he had almost destroyed hit him like a physical blow. "Is it?" he asked, his voice hoarse and barely above a whisper, but he could not finish the question. Arabella lifted her chin with the dignity he had seen in the hunting lodge, the same quiet strength that had made her tend his wounds when she had every right to leave him bleeding in the dirt. And she said, "Your father's child, the legitimate heir to Thornbury, yes." Sebastian's legs gave out, and he sank into the nearest chair as if his strings had been cut, burying his face in his hands while the full weight of what he had done crashed over him in waves that threatened to drown him because he had tried to deny his own sibling their birthright, had attacked a pregnant widow, had become the very thing he hated most in a world that had denied him his place. Lady Georgiana watched him with eyes that missed nothing, her expression stern but not entirely without compassion, and after a long moment she said, "You wished to speak with us, Mr. Wentworth. I suggest you begin." Sebastian raised his head, his face ravaged with emotion he no longer tried to hide, and he looked at Arabella with eyes that held genuine remorse. "I owe you an apology that words cannot adequately convey," he said, his voice rough with shame. "I destroyed your reputation based on assumptions, jealousy, and my own wounds. I was wrong about you, wrong about everything, and I have spent these last weeks discovering just how thoroughly I failed both you and my father's memory." Arabella remained standing, her hand resting protectively on her rounded belly, and her voice was cold as winter frost when she replied, "An apology does not restore what you took from me, Mr. Wentworth. It does not undo the scandal or rebuild my reputation or erase the terror I have felt knowing that my child might be labeled a bastard because of your accusations." "No," Sebastian agreed, meeting her eyes steadily despite the pain it cost him. "It does not. But perhaps action might begin to make amends." Lady Georgiana leaned forward. "What manner of action do you propose?" Sebastian took a breath and made his offer, the one he had rehearsed during the journey from London, but which felt inadequate now in the face of Arabella's justified anger. "I will publicly acknowledge my error. I will testify to the marriage's legitimacy. I will ensure your child is recognized as the rightful heir. I will use whatever influence I have to restore your reputation and secure your position as the Duchess of Thornbury." Arabella stared at him with suspicion, clear in her grey eyes. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you do this? You have fought against my claim, filed legal challenges, spread doubt about the marriage's validity. What has changed?" Sebastian's voice broke as he answered, "Because I have lived my entire life as the bastard son, denied my birthright through no fault of my own, I will not condemn an innocent child to a similar fate, especially not my own sibling. I will not let my mistakes poison another generation." The words hung in the sunlit drawing room, honest and raw, and Arabella studied him for a long moment before she moved to the writing desk and withdrew the documents that Mr. Dashwood had left in her keeping, the marriage certificate and witness statements, and most importantly, the letters Edmund had written explaining his marriage and his joy in it. She handed them to Sebastian without comment and watched as he read, his hands trembling as he absorbed his father's words written in that familiar, bold script. "In Arabella I have found what I thought lost to me," Edmund had written. "Joy, companionship, a reason to greet each morning with gladness rather than mere duty. Let no man say that love belongs only to the young. My heart, which I thought withered beyond revival, has bloomed once more." Sebastian read the passage aloud without meaning to, his voice thick with emotion, and when he finished, he sat in his pool of golden sunlight and felt something break open inside him, some hard shell of bitterness and resentment that had encased his heart for 28 years, because his father had been happy in those final months, had found love and comfort and joy, and Sebastian had been so consumed by his own pain that he had stayed away, had let anger keep him from Edmund's side, had denied himself the chance to know his father in those last precious weeks. Tears streaked his face, the first he had cried since childhood, and he did not try to hide them or wipe them away. Arabella watched him with an expression that held residual anger, but also something softer, unwilling compassion, perhaps, and she spoke quietly into his grief. He spoke of you, you know, in his final weeks. He grieved that you had grown distant. He wished he had found a way to acknowledge you properly. Sebastian looked up sharply, hope and pain warring in his face. He spoke of me. Often, Arabella confirmed, moving to take a seat across from him, with pride in your abilities and sorrow for the circumstances of your birth. He loved you, Sebastian, even if he could never say it as you needed to hear it. He told me you were the most capable of his children, that you had made something remarkable of yourself despite every disadvantage, that he wished society's rules allowed him to claim you as you deserved. The words were a gift Sebastian had never expected to receive, validation from beyond the grave, and fresh tears spilled down his cheeks as he absorbed them, as he let himself feel the grief he had never properly allowed himself for a father who had loved him imperfectly but truly. Outside the drawing-room windows, rain began to fall softly, pattering against the glass like quiet tears, and the autumn light shifted and changed. And in that moment of shared sorrow, something shifted between Sebastian and Arabella, some small crack appearing in the wall of justified anger she had built around her heart. Lady Georgiana rose and moved to pour brandy from the decanter on the sideboard, pressing a glass into Sebastian's hand with unexpected gentleness, and then she returned to her chair and said, "We must be practical about this. Mr. Wentworth's offer of help is generous, but we need to know it is genuine and sustained, not a momentary impulse born of shock and guilt." Sebastian drained the brandy and set the glass aside, his hands steadier now. "I understand your caution. I have given you every reason to doubt me. But I swear to you both on my father's memory that I will do everything in my power to ensure Arabella is recognized as the Duchess of Thornbury and her child as the rightful heir. I will retract my legal challenges. I will speak to anyone who will listen. I will spend whatever political capital I have to restore what I tried to destroy." Arabella studied him for a long moment, her hand still resting on her belly where new life quickened and moved. And finally she asked the question that had haunted her since the hunting lodge, in exchange for this help. "What do you want from me?" Sebastian met her eyes and said simply, "Help me understand why my father never found a way to legitimize me. Help me know him better than I did when he lived. Tell me about those final months when he was happy. Give me that much at least, even if I deserve nothing." It was a request more vulnerable than any demand, an admission of need rather than an assertion of rights. And Arabella found herself nodding before she had consciously decided to agree, because she had 3 months of memories with Edmund that no one else possessed, stories and conversations and quiet moments that Sebastian had denied himself through his own stubborn pride, and perhaps sharing them was a small price to pay for the help she desperately needed to secure her child's future. The alliance was formed then in that drawing-room with autumn rain falling and golden light fading to twilight, an uneasy partnership between the woman Sebastian had wronged and the man who was trying to become better than he had been. And though trust was still fragile, as new ice and forgiveness had not yet been spoken, it was a beginning, a first small step toward something neither of them could yet name, but both of them needed more than they would have admitted. Sebastian returned to London with the single-minded determination of a man trying to atone for sins that haunted his sleep and poisoned his waking hours, and he began a calculated campaign to restore Arabella's reputation with the same ruthless efficiency he had once applied to managing his father's northern estates, calling on every influential family he knew and using his charm and the Wentworth name to open doors that would normally have closed against scandal. He visited the Duchess of Marlborough in her Grosvenor Square mansion and presented the marriage certificate with steady hands, explaining that he had been grievously wrong in his accusations at the Ashford ball, that Lady Arabella Fairfax was in fact the legitimate Duchess of Thornbury, and he had allowed his own pain to blind him to truth. The Duchess, a formidable woman who ruled London society with an iron will wrapped in silk gloves, listened with shrewd eyes and said only, "You are asking me to believe you were mistaken about something you proclaimed so publicly. Why should I trust this reversal is genuine?" Sebastian met her gaze without flinching and replied, "Because I allowed my own pain to blind me to truth. Lady Arabella Fairfax, the Duchess of Thornbury, is a woman of unimpeachable character, and my father chose well in his final year. I was wrong, and I am spending every moment since that realization trying to make it right." He made similar calls throughout Mayfair and Belgravia, to countesses and viscounts and society matrons whose opinions shaped the ton's collective judgment, and with each conversation he felt the weight of his error more heavily, but also saw small shifts in perception, doors opening where they had been closed, curiosity replacing condemnation. The most crucial step came when he arranged an interview with the London Gazette, sitting in their offices on Fleet Street, and giving a statement that he knew would be read in every drawing-room in England. "I hereby publicly retract all statements made against Her Grace the Duchess of Thornbury," he told the journalist, who scribbled his words with eager efficiency. "I acted on assumption rather than fact, allowed bitterness to override judgment, and caused grievous harm to an innocent woman. History should remember my father's final year not as a time of decline, but as a season of unexpected joy when he found love and companionship that brought light to his remaining months." The article appeared 2 days later on the front page, and London society buzzed with shock and speculation, because Sebastian Wentworth admitting he was wrong was almost as scandalous as his original accusation, and suddenly everyone wanted to know more about this secret marriage and the young woman who had captured the dying Duke's heart. In Somerset, Arabella waited with growing anxiety, her hand constantly moving to her swelling belly, where Edmund's child kicked and turned with increasing vigour, a reminder of what hung in the balance and how little time remained before her condition would be impossible to hide. She received letters from Sebastian describing his progress, carefully worded updates that were professional rather than personal, and she read them multiple times, searching for meaning between the lines, while telling herself it did not matter what he felt, only what he accomplished. Lady Georgiana sat with her in the mornings, the two of them taking tea in the sunny breakfast room, while autumn deepened outside and leaves drifted from the trees like golden snow, and they spoke of strategies and contingencies and what would happen if Sebastian's campaign failed to sway opinion before Arabella's pregnancy became visible. Then came the letter from Lady Henrietta that made Arabella's hands shake with a fury so intense she crushed the paper in her fist before throwing it into the fire. Her stepmother had written with venomous precision, suggesting that Arabella's retreat to the countryside was suspicious, that rumours were circulating about a pregnancy, that a convenient marriage certificate produced only after Edmund's death seemed designed to legitimize a bastard child from some illicit affair, and she wondered aloud in her spiteful prose what investigation would reveal about the child's true parentage. "She seeks to destroy not just me, but an innocent child," Arabella said, her voice shaking. Her own step-grandchild. What kind of woman targets an unborn baby out of spite? Lady Georgiana took the poker and stirred the burning letter to ash. We will not let her succeed. But this does mean we must move quickly. Sebastian's social campaign has shifted opinion, but your stepmother's poison will spread if we do not counter it with irrefutable proof. A message went to London by express rider, and within 3 days Mr. Dashwood had arranged what he called a formal hearing before a panel of peers who could rule definitively on the marriage's legitimacy. 2 dukes, including the Duke of Devonshire, who had known Edmund well, an archbishop who could speak to spiritual matters, and the Lord Chancellor himself, who would ensure any ruling had the full weight of law behind it. Arabella travelled to London with Lady Georgiana, and they stayed at the Thornbury townhouse that was legally hers, though she had never set foot in it, a grand establishment in Berkeley Square, with rooms that still smelled faintly of Edmund's tobacco, and carried echoes of the man she had loved and lost. The hearing was scheduled for a crisp October morning, and Arabella dressed with painstaking care in a gown of black silk that she and Georgiana had modified specifically to conceal her pregnancy, the bodice loose and the shawl draped just so to hide the swell of her belly that was now unmistakable to anyone who looked closely. She was 6 months along, the baby active and strong, and she pressed her hand to her abdomen one last time before leaving her rooms and whispered a prayer that this child would know its birthright. The chamber in Westminster where the hearing took place was austere and intimidating, all wood panelling and high ceilings, with portraits of stern-faced predecessors staring down in judgment, and the scent of old leather and beeswax filled the air thick enough to taste. The panel of peers sat elevated on a dais, looking down at those who came to testify with expressions that gave nothing away, and Arabella felt small beneath the weight of their scrutiny as she took her seat beside Mr. Dashwood and tried to keep her breathing steady. Sebastian arrived and took his own seat across the chamber, and when their eyes met for a brief moment, she saw determination and something else she could not quite name, something that made her heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with nervousness about the hearing. The proceedings began with formal language and legal procedure, and then Arabella was called to testify, and she stood on shaking legs and told her story in a voice that started soft but grew stronger as she spoke. She described meeting Edmund, their friendship that deepened to affection and then to love, his proposal and her acceptance, the private marriage they had chosen to keep secret until after his death at his request to spare his family shock during his final illness. She presented the marriage certificate and the witness statements, and she spoke of Edmund's kindness and wit, and the joy they had shared in 3 months that felt both infinitely long and heartbreakingly brief. The panel asked questions, some gentle and some sharp, probing for inconsistencies or evidence of coercion, and Arabella answered each one with calm honesty, while her hand remained carefully folded in her lap to resist the urge to touch her belly. Then Sebastian was called to testify, and he stood before the panel with his shoulders back and his head high, despite the shame that coloured his voice as he spoke. "I made a grievous error," he said, his words carrying clearly through the chamber. "I saw my father's happiness and interpreted it as manipulation. I witnessed kindness and called it scheming. I allowed my own bitterness about my birth to poison my judgment, and I publicly destroyed an innocent woman's reputation based on nothing more than assumption and jealousy." He presented Edmund's letters, reading passages aloud that described genuine love and careful planning, and his voice remained steady even as emotion thickened it when he read his father's words about finding unexpected joy in final months. "I was wrong about Lady Arabella," Sebastian concluded, "wrong about her character, and her motives and everything I accused her of, and I have spent these weeks trying to undo the damage I caused, though I know some wounds cannot be fully healed." The Archbishop rose to testify next, an elderly man with kind eyes who had known Edmund for 40 years, and his words carried the weight of spiritual authority and personal friendship combined. Edmund Wentworth came to me 3 months before his death, he said, his voice gentle but clear, radiant with a happiness I had not seen in him since his first wife lived. He said, "I have found love again. Your Grace and I wish to ensure it is blessed and recognized in the eyes of God and man." We spoke at length about his marriage to Lady Arabella, and I can testify without reservation that it was no deathbed fancy, but a deliberate choice made by a man of sound mind and glad heart, who wanted to spend his remaining time with someone who brought him genuine joy. Arabella felt tears prick her eyes as the Archbishop spoke. Hearing Edmund's private happiness validated publicly healed something in her that she had not realized was broken, and she blinked rapidly to keep the tears from falling, while Lady Georgiana reached over to squeeze her hand. The panel withdrew to deliberate, and the wait felt endless, minutes stretching like hours while Arabella sat with her heart pounding and her child kicking inside her as if sensing the importance of this moment. When the panel returned, the Lord Chancellor stood, and the chamber fell silent, every person present holding their breath as he prepared to speak. This panel finds that the marriage between Edmund Wentworth, Duke of Thornbury, and Lady Arabella Fairfax was legal, legitimate, and entered into with full consent of both parties, he announced, his voice carrying the weight of final judgment. Lady Arabella is hereby recognized as the Duchess of Thornbury, and her issue shall inherit accordingly. Let no man question her honor or her position, and let it be known that any who continue to spread malicious rumors about her grace shall answer to this court. The words washed over Arabella like a benediction, and she closed her eyes, one hand moving unconsciously to her belly, where her child, the legitimate heir to Thornbury, rested safe and recognized at last, and relief flooded through her so intensely that the room spun, and she had to grip the edge of her chair to keep from fainting. Lady Georgiana steadied her with a firm hand and whispered, "You did it, child. You won!" And Arabella opened her eyes to find Sebastian watching her from across the chamber with an expression of such profound relief and something deeper that she could not quite read. The chamber emptied slowly as people offered congratulations, and Mr. Dashwood discussed next steps for formally registering her title and arranging for the baby's recognition as heir. And through it all, Arabella moved as if in a dream, exhausted by tension released and overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just happened. Evening, she had retreated to the small garden behind the Berkeley Square townhouse, needing air and quiet and a moment to process everything, and she stood beside the fountain that trickled softly in the darkness, while roses still bloomed despite the October chill, and the full moon cast silver light over everything. She heard footsteps on the gravel path, and turned to find Sebastian approaching slowly, hesitantly, as if she might vanish if he moved too quickly, and moonlight silvered his dark hair and cast his face in planes of light and shadow. "I wanted to offer my congratulations," he said, stopping a careful distance away. "You were magnificent today, strong and dignified, and everything my father saw in you that I was too blind to recognize." "Thank you," Arabella replied, her voice soft in the garden's stillness. "For everything you did. I know it cost you to admit your error so publicly, and I know helping me means supporting a sibling who will inherit what you always wanted. I do not take that sacrifice lightly." Sebastian shook his head. "It was not sacrifice. It was obligation. The bare minimum of what I owed you after the harm I caused. But there is something else I need to tell you, and I ask only that you listen before you send me away." Arabella nodded, her heart beginning to beat faster for reasons she did not want to examine, and Sebastian took a breath as if steeling himself for battle. "I came to restore your honor out of guilt and duty," he said, his voice low and intense in the moonlit garden. "But I remained because somewhere between reading my father's words and watching your courage and seeing the grace with which you treated me, despite everything I had done, I lost my heart entirely. I love you, Arabella, and I know I have no right to your affection. I destroyed you publicly, doubted you privately, and deserve nothing from you but the contempt you must surely feel. But I needed you to know that when I fought for you, it was not obligation that drove me. It was love. Arabella stepped back involuntarily, her hand going to her throat, where her pulse hammered wildly. "Sebastian, you cannot mean—" She started, but could not finish because the shock of his words had stolen her ability to form coherent thoughts. "I mean every word," he said, not moving closer, though his eyes held hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I do not expect you to return my feelings. I do not ask for anything from you. I simply needed you to know the truth before we go our separate ways. That somewhere in these impossible weeks I fell in love with you. And whether you believe me or not, whether you can ever forgive me or not, that love is real, and it will remain real long after tonight." The garden was silent except for the fountain's gentle music and the distant sounds of London carriages and voices that seemed very far away, leaving only the two of them in a pocket of stillness beneath the moon. And Arabella stood with her hand pressed to her throat, and her child, moving inside her and her mind reeling because she had not allowed herself to see his actions as anything more than restitution, had not permitted herself to wonder if the careful letters and tireless advocacy might stem from something deeper than guilt. And now that he had spoken the words aloud, she did not know what to feel or what to say, or whether the small flower of warmth blooming in her chest was the beginning of something dangerous or merely the aftermath of relief and vindication, making her vulnerable to kindness. Sebastian watched her face with an expression that held hope and resignation in equal measure, and when she did not speak, he nodded once as if confirming something to himself. "I will leave you to your peace," he said quietly, turning toward the path. "But know that whatever you need, whatever you want for yourself and your child, you have only to ask, and I will move heaven and earth to provide it. Not because I hope to earn your love, but because you deserve everything good this world can offer, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to make up for the harm I caused you." He walked away then, his footsteps crunching on gravel, and Arabella stood alone in the moonlit garden, with roses blooming around her and the scent of approaching rain on the air, and her hand pressed to her belly where new life grew. And she did not call him back because she was not ready, did not know if she would ever be ready, but neither did she feel the contempt he assumed she must harbor, and that absence of hatred, that small, soft place in her heart that had opened when she tended his wounds in the hunting lodge and had grown as she watched him fight for her redemption, terrified her more than anything else in this long, strange journey from widow to pariah to vindicated duchess, because it suggested that perhaps, impossibly, against all reason and wisdom, her own heart might be in danger of following where his had already gone. Arabella retreated to the Thornbury estate in Kent after the hearing, needing distance from London's scrutiny and space to think about Sebastian's confession that had turned her carefully ordered world upside down. And as her carriage rolled through the gates and up the long drive lined with ancient oaks, she felt both relief and trepidation, because this magnificent Jacobean manor of golden stone was legally hers now, the ducal seat where she would raise Edmund's child, and yet it felt like a museum of a life she had barely begun to live before death claimed her husband. The estate was beautiful in the way grand things are, all formal gardens and towering ceilings and rooms appointed with centuries of accumulated wealth. But Lady Georgiana helped her make the ducal apartments feel like a home, bringing in flowers and soft throws and rearranging furniture, until the spaces felt warm rather than intimidating. Arabella settled into a routine of quiet days, walking the gardens when weather permitted, reading in the library, surrounded by Edmund's books, and preparing for the birth that grew closer with each passing week, as autumn deepened toward winter and her belly swelled with life that kicked and turned with increasing vigor. The first letter from Sebastian arrived a week after her arrival in Kent, delivered by a rider who handed it to her with careful formality, and Arabella had stared at the sealed paper for a long moment before opening it, half expecting declarations or pleas or demands for response to his confession of love. Instead, she found thoughtful correspondence about the northern estates he still managed, a question about whether she had decided how to handle certain tenant disputes that required ducal authority, and a mention of a book on agricultural reform he thought might interest her, given some comments she had made during their conversations in Somerset. The letter was friendly, respectful, and made no mention whatsoever of love or feelings or that moonlit garden confession, and Arabella read it 3 times, trying to understand what game he was playing before realizing it was not a game at all, but simply Sebastian offering the friendship and support he had promised, without pressing for anything more. She wrote back about the tenant disputes, asked his opinion on estate matters she was still learning to navigate, and mentioned she would welcome the book recommendation, and thus began a weekly correspondence that became the thing Arabella looked forward to most in her increasingly isolated existence. Sebastian's letters arrived like clockwork every Thursday, and they were never what she expected, filled with observations about the world that made her laugh despite herself, discussions of books and ideas and the peculiar beauty of the northern landscape in winter, and always somewhere woven through the practical talk about estates and tenants. There would be a line or two that revealed something of himself he had never shown before. "I have been thinking about redemption lately," he wrote in one letter as November frost began to silver the mornings, not the grand dramatic sort, but the quiet kind built in daily choices to be better than one was yesterday. "I am trying, Arabella, not to earn your forgiveness because I have no right to ask for it, but because you deserve a world where men do not destroy what they do not understand." She sat in the library with that letter in her hands, and one hand resting on her belly where the baby kicked as if responding to her emotional turmoil, and she realized with something close to panic that her feelings had shifted without her permission, hatred giving way to understanding, and understanding bleeding into something dangerously close to love. Lady Georgiana found her there one afternoon holding Sebastian's latest letter with a small smile touching her lips, and her aunt raised an eyebrow in that knowing way she had. "He writes of books and estate management, and the stars he observes from his northern windows," Arabella said softly. "Never once does he speak of love or ask for anything from me. And yet his restraint speaks louder than declarations ever could," Lady Georgiana finished, settling into the chair across from her niece. "The question is, what will you do about it, child? Because a man who loved you less would be pressing his advantage, demanding response. But Sebastian gives you space to feel what you feel, without obligation or pressure. And that is either the work of a master manipulator or a man who genuinely loves you enough to want your happiness more than his own satisfaction." Arabella looked down at her swollen belly, at the life that would arrive soon and change everything, and whispered, "I do not know if I can trust this. Trust him? How do I love someone who wounded me so deeply? How do I know this is real and not just guilt making him kind?" "You do not know," Georgiana said gently. "You choose to trust, or you choose to protect yourself. Both are valid, and neither is wrong. But I will tell you this. I have watched that man transform himself through sheer force of will. I have seen him sacrifice pride and position and the inheritance he always wanted to ensure your child gets what is rightfully theirs. And while past harm does not disappear simply because someone changes, neither does change become meaningless because harm was done. The choice is yours and yours alone. The conversation haunted Arabella through the next weeks as her pregnancy reached its final stage, and her body grew heavy and uncomfortable, and the baby's movements became so strong they sometimes took her breath away, and she found herself reading Sebastian's letters over and over, looking for evidence of manipulation or hidden agenda, and finding instead only consistent kindness and the gradual revelation of a man trying to become better than he had been. Labor began on a cold November night when rain lashed the windows and wind howled around the manor's stone walls, Arabella waking to pain that gripped her belly like a vice and wetness between her legs that told her the time had come. Lady Georgiana was there within minutes, summoning the midwife and helping Arabella into a night shift suitable for birthing, and as another contraction took her, Arabella gasped out words she did not plan. "Send for Sebastian," she said through gritted teeth. "Please, I need—" And she could not finish, but Georgiana understood, and raised an eyebrow, but sent a rider into the storm without question. Sebastian received the message at his northern estate, where he had been writing another letter to Arabella by candlelight, choosing each word with care, trying to show her who he was without the armor of anger he had worn for so long. And when he read that she was in labor and asking for him, he did not stop to question why or what it meant, but simply called for his fastest horse and rode through the night with rain soaking him to the skin, and fear making his heart pound because she was early. The baby was coming too soon, and he could not bear the thought of losing either of them now. He arrived at Thornbury as dawn was breaking grey and cold, his horse lathered and steaming, his own face drawn with exhaustion and worry, and a footman took his soaked coat, while Lady Georgiana met him in the entrance hall with an expression that gave nothing away. "She has been labouring since midnight," Georgiana said. "The baby is small and coming early, and it is difficult. She asked for you specifically, and I do not know why, but I suggest you wait in the library, and I will send word when there is news." Sebastian paced the library like a caged animal, starting at every sound from the floors above, running his hands through his still damp hair until it stood on end, and he found himself praying to a god he was not sure he believed in, offering bargains and promises if only Arabella and the baby would be safe. Hours crawled past with agonizing slowness, morning shifting to afternoon, and Sebastian heard nothing but occasional footsteps in the hallway, and once a cry that might have been pain or effort or both, and made his blood run cold. He stared at the books lining the walls, Edmund's collection that Arabella now treasured, and he thought about his father finding unexpected joy in final months, and he prayed that Arabella would have years and years to find her own happiness, with or without him, because she deserved everything good this world could offer. When the library door finally opened, Sebastian spun around with his heart in his throat, and the midwife stood there with tired eyes and a small smile. "A healthy son." "Your Grace," she said, using the title that belonged to the infant just born, small but strong and with a good set of lungs. "Her Grace the Duchess is exhausted, but well and asking for you." Sebastian sank into the nearest chair as relief washed over him so intensely his legs would not hold him, and he buried his face in his hands and felt hot tears leak between his fingers, tears of relief and joy and overwhelming gratitude that they had both survived. He followed the midwife up the stairs on shaking legs, and she led him to the ducal apartments where firelight flickered warm and golden, and there on the great bed Arabella lay propped against pillows, with her hair damp and her face pale, but her eyes bright, and in her arms she held a tiny bundle wrapped in soft blankets. Sebastian approached slowly, reverently, and when Arabella held out the baby to him, he took the small, warm weight with infinite gentleness, his large hands cradling his half-brother as if the infant were made of spun glass. The baby had Edmund's eyes, grey and alert despite his newness to the world, and a cap of dark hair, and Sebastian felt protective love crash over him like a wave, fierce and unconditional and absolute. "Hello, little brother," he whispered, voice breaking with emotion. "You will never doubt your place in this world. I promise you that. He has our father's eyes. He will never know him, but I will tell him. I will make sure he knows Edmund was a good man who found happiness at the end." Tears streaked Sebastian's face, and he made no attempt to hide them, simply stood there cradling the new Duke of Thornbury, while Arabella watched from the bed with an expression that held exhaustion and tenderness, and something else that made her own eyes shine with unshed tears. "Thank you for coming," she said softly, holding out her hand to him. "I know I had no right to ask, but I needed you here." Sebastian carefully transferred the baby back to her arms and took her hand in his, bringing it to his lips in a gesture that was both reverent and desperate. "You have every right," he said hoarsely, "to anything I can give. Always. I was terrified when I got your message, terrified I would lose you both, and I realized that somewhere in these weeks of letters and waiting, I had come to think of this child as mine, to protect, even though he is my brother. And you are." He stopped, unable to finish, because the words were too big and too raw. "I love you," Arabella said, the words quiet but certain in the fire-lit room. I fought it, was terrified of it, told myself it was gratitude or relief or anything but love. But watching you with my son just now, seeing the tenderness and the fierce protectiveness, and knowing that you would give him everything you never had, I cannot deny it any more. I love you, Sebastian, not despite what you did, but with full knowledge of it, because loving you does not erase the harm, but it acknowledges who you have become. Sebastian knelt beside the bed, still holding her hand, and wept openly, great shuddering sobs that shook his whole frame, and Arabella reached out with her free hand to touch his hair in a gesture of comfort and acceptance. And between them, the baby made small snuffling sounds, oblivious to the adult drama surrounding his first hours of life. The story might have ended there in that moment of confession and acceptance. But life continued as it always does, weeks turning to months, and young Edmund Charles Wentworth grew from a tiny, fragile infant to a healthy, thriving baby who smiled at faces and grabbed at anything within reach. Sebastian became a constant presence at Thornbury, not living there but visiting often, and slowly Arabella's household came to expect him, came to see him not as the man who had destroyed their mistress, but as the man who was helping her rebuild. The christening was planned for a perfect May day, when spring had fully arrived and the estate gardens bloomed with daffodils and early roses, and the private chapel was filled with family, including Henry, who had surprised everyone by being genuinely happy about his nephew's birth and holding no resentment about losing an inheritance he had never expected until Edmund's death. Arabella stood as godmother while Sebastian stood as godfather, and when the Archbishop pronounced the baby's names, Edmund Charles Wentworth, after both his father and his half-brother, Sebastian's eyes met Arabella's across the chapel. And everything they had survived and become was in that look, all the pain and transformation and hard-won love that had brought them to this moment. After the ceremony, as guests milled about drinking champagne and cooing over the young Duke, Arabella and Sebastian slipped away to the garden, where he had first confessed his feelings that October night that felt like a lifetime ago, and roses bloomed now in the warm May evening, and the air smelled of growth and possibility. Sebastian took both her hands in his, and then knelt on the same gravel path where he had stood in moonlight and poured out his heart. "I have been thinking about redemption," he said, echoing words from an old letter, "and forgiveness, and what it means to love someone, not despite their flaws, but with full knowledge of them. I cannot undo what I did to you, cannot erase those months of pain, but I can promise you that every day for the rest of my life I will work to be worthy of the extraordinary gift of your love. Arabella, will you marry me? Not because of duty or for your son's sake, but because we choose each other freely." "Yes," Arabella said without hesitation, "because you are not the man who destroyed me at that ball. You are the man who rebuilt me, who fought for me, who showed me that redemption is real. Yes, Sebastian, 1,000 times yes." He slid a ring onto her finger, a sapphire surrounded by diamonds that caught the evening light and threw blue fire. And then he rose and kissed her properly for the first time, tender and reverent and full of promise for the future they would build together. They married 3 months later in the same chapel where Edmund Charles had been christened, a small ceremony with only family present, and when Sebastian spoke his vows, his voice was steady and sure. "I vow to honor not just the woman you are, but the journey that made you. I vow to cherish the son you gave my father, and to be the father he deserves. I vow to love you fiercely, protect you faithfully, and remind you daily of your immeasurable worth." Arabella's own vows matched his in their honesty and depth. "I vow to see you as you are now, not as you were. I vow to build a future that honors the past without being imprisoned by it. I vow to love you with clear eyes and an open heart, knowing that the strongest foundations are often built on the ruins of what came before." When they emerged from the chapel as husband and wife, young Edmund was waiting in Lady Georgiana's arms, reaching for Sebastian with chubby hands and babbling nonsense syllables that might have been an attempt at speech. And Sebastian took him with the easy confidence of someone who had spent months learning to be a father to this child who was brother and stepson combined. The three of them stood on the chapel steps with spring sunlight warming their faces and daffodils blooming all around, and the future stretching before them bright with possibility. And if the journey to this moment had been painful and difficult and marked by scandal and suffering, the destination made every trial worthwhile. Arabella looked at her husband holding her son with such tenderness, at the estate that was now their shared home, at the family they had created from the ruins of what might have been only tragedy. And she thought about Edmund, who had given her 3 months of unexpected joy and a child who would inherit his title. And she thought about Sebastian, who had destroyed her and then rebuilt her, and in doing so had rebuilt himself. This was not the life she had imagined when she married a dying duke in a secret ceremony, not the future she had dreamed of during those terrifying months when scandal threatened to consume her, but it was real and hard-won and built on foundations of forgiveness and transformation, and the kind of love that chooses daily to be better than it was yesterday. The Duke's bastard had indeed ruined her at that ball, not knowing she carried his father's legitimate heir, and from that catastrophic collision of pain and misunderstanding had come something neither of them could have predicted: redemption and partnership, and a love that acknowledged the past without being destroyed by it. And as Sebastian pressed a kiss to her temple, and young Edmund grabbed at his cravat with sticky fingers, Arabella smiled and thought that sometimes the best endings are the ones nobody could have written at the beginning, the ones that emerge from the wreckage of what was supposed to happen and become something far more precious for having been so dearly bought.